They were certain their tanks were unbeatable. The Type 95 Hago had performed admirably against Chinese forces, faced Soviet armor at Khalkhin Gol, and spearheaded sweeping victories across Malaya and the Philippines. Japanese tank crews believed their light tanks embodied the peak of armored design, ideally suited for the jungles and islands of the Pacific. They had defeated every foe they'd met. But they were mistaken. Their realization began not with failure, but with confidence built on years of triumph. The Hago was no accident of engineering. It emerged from calculated military planning that began in 1933 when the Imperial Japanese Army recognized a gap in its mechanized forces. The existing Type 89 medium tank, Japan's workhorse, could barely reach 15 miles per hour, adequate for infantry support but too slow for modern mechanized warfare. Japanese strategists, observing rapid developments in European armored doctrine, wanted a lighter vehicle that could keep pace with motorized troops traveling up to 40 mm, handle the terrain of Manchuria and China, and be mass-produced by Japan's limited industrial base. Specifications were issued in mid-1933. The new tank should weigh around 7 tons, mount a 37 Loud 37mm gun, reach 40 km/h, and possess armor capable of deflecting rifle and machine gun fire. Simplicity and ease of maintenance were essential. Mitsubishi Heavy Industries received the contract with engineer Tomio Hara, already renowned for his work on the Type 89, leading the project. His key innovation was the bell crank suspension, a rugged and simple design that would define Japanese tanks for the next decade. By June 1934, the first prototype was ready. Trials in both Manchuria and Japan impressed Army evaluators. The tank was quick, 45 km/h on roads, around 30 cross-country, and agile, with a surprisingly tight turning radius. The new suspension absorbed shocks effectively, letting it cross terrain that would stop heavier vehicles. Its 6-cylinder air-cooled Mitsubishi diesel engine delivered 120 horsepower at 1,800 RPM and was praised for reliability. The use of diesel, less flammable than gasoline and more plentiful across Japan's empire, was a deliberate advantage. With a 34-gallon capacity, the Hago could travel up to 130 miles on roads before refueling. Field tests did reveal issues. The suspension caused violent pitching on rough ground, making it nearly impossible to aim accurately while moving and exhausting the crew. Engineers improved it by linking the bogie pairs with braces, creating what became known as the Manchurian suspension. The fix helped, but didn't eliminate the harsh ride that would define the tank's service life. In 1935, the Army Technical Bureau officially presented the design as Japan's next light tank. Infantry officers objected that its 12 mm armor was too thin for assault support. Cavalry officers countered that its speed and agility compensated for protection, and its firepower was sufficient for its role. After debate, the Army approved it as the Type 95 Hago, the number referencing the 2595th year of Japan's imperial calendar. Production began in 1936 at Mitsubishi plants. The Hago was compact, just 438 bonnet seat, 28 meters long, 2.6 meters wide, and 2.13 meters tall, weighing 7.4 tons empty and about 8 tons loaded. Its armor was minimal, 12 mm on the turret and upper hull, 9 mm on the roof, and as little as 6 mm in non-critical spots. It could stop small arms fire but little else. Designed to fight lightly armed Chinese and Soviet forces, it was sufficient for a time. The crew of 3 worked in extremely cramped conditions. The driver sat front left, peering through a narrow viewport. To his right, a machine gunner operated a Type 97 7.7mm weapon. The commander occupied the turret alone, standing the entire time, loading, aiming, and firing the 37mm Type 94 main gun, while also manning a rear-mounted machine gun angled to cover the tank's flank. With no turret basket and little room to move, his job was punishing. Only 1 in 4 tanks carried a radio. The rest relied on signal flags. Allied tankers later marveled at how Japanese crews managed to function at all under such conditions. Despite its flaws, the Hago performed impressively against the enemies it was built to fight. In China, starting in 1937, it proved devastating. Against infantry with no armor and few anti-tank weapons, the 37 BNV, 49 gun, and dual machine guns were lethal. The tank's mobility let it exploit breakthroughs and chase retreating forces. Victories came easily, breeding dangerous overconfidence. That illusion shattered in 1939 at Khalkhin Gol, where Japanese forces faced the Soviet Red Army on the Mongolian border. Here, the Hago met real opposition. Soviet BT-5 and BT-7 tanks with 45 mm WWII guns capable of piercing its armor from long range. On July 2, 1939, Japan's 3rd Tank Regiment attacked Soviet positions and initially succeeded through surprise and aggression, destroying 32 Soviet tanks. But when the Soviets counterattacked, the Hago's weaknesses became fatal. Soviet shells sliced through its thin armor with ease. By campaign's end, Japan had lost dozens of tanks. The lesson was obvious, to some. The Hago was hopelessly outclassed by modern armor. Its light protection and weak gun were no match for peer adversaries. Yet rather than redesign their tank forces, Japanese leaders focused on tactics and training. In China, their light tanks still worked, and so they convinced themselves the design was sound. When the Pacific War erupted in December 1941, Hagos again found success. Racing through jungles British commanders believed impassable for armor. In Malaya, they rolled through plantations and muddy trails, supporting Japan's rapid advance toward Singapore. The British, with little armor of their own, were caught completely off guard by the speed and ferocity of Japan's light tanks. In the Philippines, Hagos landed with the invasion force and supported Japanese infantry operations. On December 22, 1941, north of De Mortis, Type 95 tanks engaged American M3 Stuart light tanks in what would be recorded as the first tank versus tank battle involving U.S. forces in the Pacific. Both tanks mounted 37 BAMI twins, guns. The M3 had better armor, 32 mm, on the turret sides compared to the Hago's 12 mm. But at close range in jungle fighting, the Japanese achieved some success, destroying one M3 in the initial engagement. These early victories reinforced Japanese confidence. From their perspective, the Hago was performing exactly as designed. It was mobile, reliable, and effective in supporting infantry operations across diverse terrain. Tank crews trusted their machines. Commanders relied on their armor. And when orders came to defend Saipan, the Japanese brought their tanks without questioning their adequacy. Saipan was different from the battles that had come before. The island in the Mariana Chain was strategically vital, positioned just 250 miles from Tokyo. If the Americans captured Saipan, their B-29 bombers would be within range of the Japanese home islands. The Empire's leaders knew this. They fortified Saipan with approximately 30,000 troops, nearly double what American intelligence estimated. Among the defenders was the 9th Tank Regiment, commanded by Colonel Takashi Guto. The regiment was equipped with 44 tanks, a mixture of Type 95 Haros and the slightly larger Type 97 Chiha medium tanks. The Chihas were better armed with 57mm guns, but shared the thin armor that characterized Japanese tank design. These tanks represented a significant armored force by Pacific standards, certainly the largest the Americans had yet faced. The Americans began their assault on June 15, 1944. Vice Admiral Richmond Kelly Turner ordered the landing force ashore at 0542 hours. By 0700, landing craft were moving toward the beaches. At 0840, the first wave hit the shore. The 2nd and 4th Marine Divisions landed on Saipan's western beaches under heavy fire from Japanese artillery and mortars positioned on the heights overlooking the landing zones. The Marines fought their way inland against fierce resistance. By nightfall of the 15th, 20,000 American combat troops were ashore. Equipment and supplies poured onto the beaches. Among the equipment were M4 Sherman medium tanks landing from LST vessels and moving forward to support the infantry. The Marines established a beachhead, but it was not yet secure. Japanese artillery could still reach the beaches. Counterattacks continued through the night. On June 16th, the Marines consolidated their positions and began pushing inland. The 2nd Marine Division worked to close gaps in the line, while the 4th Marine Division cleared areas around key terrain. General Holland Smith, commanding the Assault Force, committed his reserves, bringing elements of the 27th Infantry Division ashore to reinforce the beachhead. Lieutenant General Yoshitsugu Saito, commanding Japanese forces on Saipan, recognized the critical situation. If the Americans consolidated their beachhead and brought their full combat power ashore, dislodging them would become impossible. He needed to strike before they were fully prepared. Saito issued orders for a major counterattack using the island's most powerful assets, the infantry of the 136th Regiment and the tanks of the 9th Tank Regiment. The attack order was specific. The infantry would assault the American positions around Guadalcanal airfield. The tank unit would advance southwest of Hill 164.6, moving after the infantry attack commenced. The tanks would charge the transmitting station and throw the enemy into disorder before the infantry penetrated the sector. It was an ambitious plan requiring coordination between infantry and armor in a night attack across difficult terrain. Colonel Guto gathered his tank crews. They conducted final maintenance checks on their vehicles. Crews loaded ammunition, from in Thurthfroth, sent meter rounds for the Harrows, 57 fee. Brought in theaters for the Chihas. They filled fuel tanks, checked track tension, tested the radios on the few tanks that had them. The crews were confident. Many had combat experience from China or earlier Pacific campaigns. They trusted their machines and their tactics. In the pre-dawn darkness of June the 17th, the Japanese tank column moved out. Diesel engines coughed to life, their distinctive sound echoing across the pre-dawn landscape. Tracks clanked as the tanks formed up and began their approach toward the American lines. Inside each cramped vehicle, crews felt the familiar vibration and noise of their tanks in motion. Commanders stood in their turrets, trying to see through the darkness, coordinating movement through visual signals. The Americans heard them coming. Marine sentries on the perimeter reported engine sounds from the north. Officers shouted orders. Men grabbed weapons and moved to defensive positions. Anti-tank gun crews traversed their 37mm M3 guns toward the approaching sounds. Sherman tank crews, who had bedded down near their vehicles, climbed aboard and started engines. Machine gun teams checked their weapons and ammunition. At 03:30 hours, the Japanese attack began in earnest. 44 tanks, the largest armored formation yet committed by Japan in the Pacific, advanced toward the 2nd Marine Division's positions. Some tanks carried infantry clinging to the hulls, a dangerous but sometimes effective tactic. The formation moved through the darkness, guided by the lead tanks and following the terrain toward their objectives. Marine riflemen saw them first as dark shapes emerging from the pre-dawn gloom. Then came the distinctive sound of diesel engines at full throttle, tracks throwing dirt and dust, the clank of bogie wheels, and the squeal of steel on steel. Japanese tankers could see Marines in their positions, could see the defensive line ahead. Some commanders opened fire with their hull machine guns, sweeping the ground ahead. Others reserved fire, trying to get closer before engaging. Then something unexpected happened. Something that would fundamentally change how Marines viewed Japanese armor for the rest of the war. Marine machine gunners positioned in foxholes and behind cover opened fire with their Browning M2 heavy machine guns. These were not the standard infantry machine guns. the 30 caliber weapons that provided supporting fire. These were 50 caliber weapons, heavy machine guns designed to engage aircraft and destroy light vehicles. The 50 caliber Browning M2 was a formidable weapon designed near the end of World War I and perfected in the decades since. It fired a 12.7 mm round at a muzzle velocity exceeding 2,900 ft/s. The standard ammunition load included ball rounds for general use and armor-piercing rounds specifically, designed to defeat light armor and fortifications. The armor-piercing variant could penetrate 23 mm of face-hardened steel armor plate at 200 mm. At 500 mm, it could still penetrate 19 mm. These were not theoretical numbers. They were verified test results confirmed through extensive firing trials at American Ordnance Proving Grounds. The ammunition had been designed to engage lightly armored aircraft and vehicles, not to defeat tanks. But the mathematics of armor penetration are unforgiving. The Type 95 Hargo's armor was 12 mm thick at its maximum on the turret front and sides. On the upper hull, the thickest armor on the entire vehicle was 12 mm. Simple arithmetic revealed the problem. The 50 caliber armor-piercing round could penetrate nearly twice that thickness at close range. At the ranges where the battle was being fought, 200 meters or less as tanks closed with Marine positions, the 50 caliber had more than enough penetrating power. Marine machine gunners opened fire. Tracer rounds arced across the battlefield in brilliant orange-red lines. The sound was distinctive. The heavy boom, boom, boom of 50 caliber machine guns firing at sustained rate. Gunners aimed at the advancing tanks, some not entirely believing their weapons would be effective against armor. What happened next shocked both sides. The 50 caliber armor-piercing rounds didn't just dent the tanks. They didn't ricochet off at angles. They penetrated cleanly, decisively. At close range, some rounds went completely through the thin armor, entering one side of the tank and exiting the other. Even at longer ranges, the rounds punched through the armor with energy to spare. Inside the Japanese tanks, crews experienced something far worse than defeat. They experienced revelation. The heavy machine gun fire wasn't just loud impacts on the outside of the hull. It was penetration, rounds coming through the armor. In the cramped interior of a cargo, there was nowhere to hide. A round that penetrated the hull could strike engine components, ammunition racks, or crew members. The face-hardened armor designed to resist rifle fire offered no meaningful protection against the heavy 50 caliber rounds. One Marine machine gunner firing his weapon from a position near the airfield reported watching his tracer round strike a Hargo, advancing directly toward him. The rounds hit the front hull and he could see sparks inside the tank through vision ports and hatches. The tank kept coming for a moment, then slowed, then stopped. Engine smoke poured from the rear deck. The crew attempted to bail out. Two men emerged. They were immediately engaged by rifle fire from Marines in foxholes. Another gunner positioned with his weapon mounted on a half-track engaged a cargo at approximately 150 meters. He fired a sustained burst into the tank's side armor. The tank turned toward him, exposing more of its flank. He kept firing. His loader fed another belt of ammunition into the gun. He watched the commander in the turret slump forward, then fall. The bullet had gone through the thin turret armor, struck the man, and continued through the other side. The commander never knew what hit him. A third Marine, manning a 50 caliber in a fixed position on the defensive line, engaged multiple tanks as they advanced. He fired at one Hargo's engine compartment, aiming for the rear deck where the cooling vents were located. His rounds penetrated the thin 6 mm armor covering the engine. The diesel engine, its cylinders opened by 50 caliber impacts, seized. The tank stopped moving, becoming a stationary target. The crew abandoned it, running back toward Japanese lines through a hail of small arms fire. Japanese tank crews who survived the initial assault couldn't process what was happening. They had trained for years. They had fought in China where enemy weapons bounced harmlessly off their armor. They had faced Soviet anti-tank rifles at Khalkhin Gol and survived. Their tanks were supposed to protect them. That was the fundamental premise of armored warfare. The tank's armor kept the crew alive while they engaged the enemy with superior firepower. But American machine guns were defeating their armor. Not anti-tank guns firing large-caliber projectiles, not artillery, not even the massive 75mm guns on the Sherman tanks they could see moving into position. Machine guns, infantry support weapons, weapons that were mounted on jeeps, on half-tracks, on every vehicle in the American arsenal. The realization was devastating. If machine guns could penetrate their tanks, what chance did they have? A Japanese tank officer, later captured after his tank was disabled, told American interrogators that his first thought was that the Americans must have developed some new secret weapon, some advanced ammunition or special gun that looked like a standard machine gun but fired exotic projectiles. He simply could not accept that a conventional heavy machine gun could defeat a tank. In his entire combat experience, from training in Manchuria to fighting in China, small arms fire had always been ineffective against armor. Bullets made noise on the outside. They didn't come through. But the Browning M2 was in an entirely different category from anything the Japanese had previously encountered. With its armor-piercing rounds, it had sufficient energy and penetrating power to defeat 12mm armor at any range where a machine gunner could accurately engage a target. And the Marines had these weapons everywhere. They were standard equipment throughout the American military. As the Japanese tank attack faltered under this unexpected fire, Sherman tanks moved forward to engage. The contrast was stark. Where the cargo weighed 7.44 tons, the M4A2 Sherman, the variant used by Marines at Saipan, weighed 31.8 tons. Where the Hargo had 12mm of armor, the Sherman had 51 mm on the frontal hull, angled at 56 degrees to provide effective protection, equivalent to approximately 75 mm against anti-tank fire. The Sherman mounted a 75mm gun as its main armament. This gun could penetrate the Hargo's armor from over a mile away. When Shermans opened fire on the Japanese tanks, the outcome was predetermined. 75mm armor-piercing rounds struck Hargos and Kihas with devastating effect. Tanks were blown apart. Turrets were knocked off hulls. Ammunition detonated inside crew compartments. Japanese tanks that returned fire found their 37mm and 57mm rounds completely ineffective against the Sherman's frontal armor. The shells bounced off or created small dents without penetrating. One Japanese tank commander, whose cargo was disabled by .50 caliber fire, but whose turret could still traverse, attempted to engage a Sherman at close range. He ordered his gunner to fire. The 37mm gun fired its armor-piercing round. The projectile struck the Sherman's turret face. There was a flash of impact. The Sherman didn't even slow down. It continued to rotate its turret with mechanical precision, aimed and fired a single 75mm round. The cargo exploded. The battle evolved into what one Marine officer later described as a madhouse of noise, traces, and flashing lights. Disabled tanks burned, illuminating other tanks still trying to advance. Infantry that had been riding on the tanks scattered, seeking cover in shell holes and drainage ditches. Some Japanese infantry made it to the Marine lines, fighting desperate close-range battles in and around American positions. Marine infantry, hunkered in their foxholes, found themselves with Japanese tanks passing directly over them. One Marine later reported that a cargo leaking oil heavily soaked him as it passed over his position. He remained still until it moved on, then emerged and threw a thermite grenade into the engine compartment as the tank moved past. The tank began burning from the inside. Another Marine, lying low in his foxhole as a tank rolled over him, jumped out after it passed and jammed a coconut log into the bogie wheels. The tank spun in place, tracks throwing dirt, unable to move forward. When the confused tank commander opened his turret hatch to see what was wrong, the Marine jumped onto the tank and dropped a thermite grenade into the open turret. The tank exploded from internal fires, igniting all ammunition. By mid-morning on June the 17th, the Japanese counterattack was over. 31 destroyed Japanese tanks littered the battlefield, counted by Marines walking through the area after the fighting stopped. Some sources suggest as many as 35 tanks were destroyed, when including those knocked out by artillery fire beyond the immediate battle area. Perhaps 1,000 Japanese soldiers were dead, including many of the tank crews and the infantry who had advanced with them. For the Marines, the victory was significant, but grim. They had stopped a major armored assault, but the cost had been substantial. The 2nd Marine Division's commander later acknowledged that if the Japanese attack had succeeded, it would have been fatal to the division's fighting efficiency. The battle had been close, decided as much by American firepower and Japanese tactical errors as by overwhelming superiority. But for Marines walking among the destroyed tanks afterward, examining the vehicles up close, a different truth emerged. The Japanese tanks were not the formidable war machines they had expected. A Marine officer called Heisman over to look at a destroyed cargo. He pointed to the holes in the armor. They were clean, round penetrations where 50 caliber bullets had punched through. The exit holes on the far side were slightly larger, rough-edged, where the bullets had torn through after crossing the interior. You could put your fist through some of the holes. Inside the destroyed tank, the scene was worse. The cramped interior showed signs of multiple penetrations. The commander's position in the turret had no protective features, no armor that would stop heavy machine gun fire. The manual traverse for the turret consisted of a simple hand crank. The gun controls were rudimentary. There was almost no space to move. The hull machine gunner's position was a small cubby with minimal visibility. The driver had a crude periscope and a small vision port. Everything was cramped, crude by American standards, and utterly vulnerable to 50 caliber fire. Marines who had fought at Guadalcanal 2 years earlier remembered seeing Hargos there. At the time, with Marines equipped primarily with light weapons and no armor support of their own, the Japanese tanks had seemed threatening. But now, with proper equipment, with heavy weapons and their own armor, the Hargo looked exactly like what it was. A light tank from the mid-1930s, adequate for its original design parameters, utterly inadequate for modern industrial warfare against a peer adversary. The psychological impact on surviving Japanese tank crews was profound. Those who were captured, whose disabled tanks left them with no choice but surrender, had to grapple with uncomfortable truths. Their tanks were not just outmatched, they were obsolete. The equipment they had trusted with their lives offered no protection against weapons the Americans used as standard infantry support. Intelligence officers interrogating prisoners noted a consistent pattern in their responses. The Japanese tankers expressed shock at American firepower. They talked about the quantity and quality of American equipment. They mentioned the casual abundance of ammunition and supplies they had witnessed. Many expressed feelings of betrayal that their own leaders had sent them into. Battle with inadequate equipment while telling them they had technological parity. One veteran tank commander, who had fought in China since 1937, told interrogators that he had believed Japan would win the war. Through superior fighting spirit and devotion to the emperor, after Saipan, after seeing his tank penetrated by machine gun fire, after watching American Sherman shrug off Japanese anti-tank fire, he knew that spirit could not overcome material disadvantages. Training and courage meant nothing when your equipment was fundamentally inadequate. These reports were compiled, analyzed, and sent back to commanders throughout the Pacific. The lessons learned at Saipan would inform Marine tactics for the rest of the war. Japanese tanks were not a serious threat. Standard infantry heavy weapons, particularly the 50 caliber machine gun, were effective against them. Combined with bazookas, 37mm anti-tank guns, and Sherman tanks, Marines had overwhelming firepower against Japanese armor. Word spread through the Marine ranks quickly. You didn't need specialized anti-tank weapons to engage a Japanese tank. Your .50 caliber machine gun would do the job. This knowledge changed how Marines approached subsequent island battles. The fear that came with facing armor, the concern about tanks breaking through infantry lines, evaporated. Japanese armor became just another target, and not a particularly dangerous one. The Battle of Saipan continued for weeks after the failed tank attack. Marines and Army troops fought their way across the island against fierce Japanese resistance. The terrain was brutal, ranging from flat sugarcane fields to swamps, to volcanic cliffs to Mount Topchow, which rose 1,554 feet above sea level. Fighting in caves, ravines, and gullies consumed men and ammunition. The island was declared secure on July 9, 1944. The victory at Saipan had strategic consequences that reached far beyond the island. With the Maranas in American hands, B-29 bombers could reach Tokyo. The psychological impact on Japanese leadership was severe. Emperor Hirohito recognized that American control of Saipan meant Tokyo would be bombed. Prime Minister Hideki Tojo resigned on July 18th. For the first time, Japanese media admitted the war was going poorly. The loss shook Japan's confidence in ultimate victory. For Japanese tank crews across the Pacific, Saipan was a turning point. Word of the battle spread through military channels. Tank units on other islands heard what had happened. They knew their equipment was inadequate. They knew American weapons could penetrate their armor, but there was nothing they could do about it. The tanks they had were the only tanks Japan could provide. Japan's industrial capacity simply could not produce modern tanks in meaningful numbers. The nation's factories were strained by years of war. Resources were limited, with American submarines cutting off access to raw materials from Southeast Asia. Strategic priorities focused on aircraft production for kamikaze attacks and on coastal defense artillery for the anticipated invasion of the home islands. Tanks were a low priority. Japanese engineers had designed better tanks. The Type 3 Chinu mounting a 75mm gun, the Type 4 CH-2 with even heavier armament. But these existed primarily as prototypes and small production runs. Only 166 Chinas were built during the entire war. 2 Cheetos, none saw combat. They were saved for the defense of Japan itself, never sent to Eastland battlefields where they might have made a difference. Meanwhile, American production capacity was almost incomprehensible by Japanese standards. The Detroit Tank Arsenal, built by Chrysler Corporation, was a purpose-built facility dedicated to tank production. In December 1942 alone, the arsenal's 5,000 workers produced 97 Sherman tanks. That was more tanks in a single month than Japan produced in an entire year. The arsenal was not alone in this remarkable production achievement. Fisher Tank Arsenal, built in Grand Blanc, Michigan, was another government F-funed facility, operated by General Motors Fisher Body Division. Pfizer produced over 11,000 Shermans in multiple variants, making it one of the highest volume producers. Like the Detroit Arsenal, Pfizer could produce hundreds of tanks per month when operating at peak capacity. American Locomotive Company in Schenectady, New York, converted from locomotive production to build 2,300 Sherman tanks. Baldwin Locomotive Works in Philadelphia produced over 200 tanks while maintaining locomotive production for the war effort. Lemur Locomotive Works in Ohio built the first production M4A1 Sherman, a tank named Michael that was shipped to England and still resides at the Boynton Tank Museum. Lemur produced 1655 tanks before returning to full-time locomotive production. Pacific Car and Foundry in Washington State, Press Steel Car Company in Pennsylvania, Pullman Standard Manufacturing in Illinois, and Federal Machine and Welder in Ohio all contributed to Sherman production. 10 major manufacturers plus countless subcontractors producing components, tracks, engines, radios, optics, and weapons. The industrial mobilization was unprecedented in human history. The Detroit Arsenal itself was a marvel of modern production engineering. Built on 567 acres in Warren, Michigan, the facility covered over 1.5 million square feet of production space. Assembly lines snaked through the building for miles. Massive overhead cranes could lift complete tank hulls and move them between workstations. The factory operated 3 shifts, 24 hours per day, 7 days a week. Workers included men who had been automotive workers before the war, bringing their manufacturing expertise to tank production. But they also included thousands of women, many of whom had never worked in heavy industry before. These women often called Rosie the riveters, welded armor plate, assembled turrets, installed engines, and performed every job in the plant except the heaviest lifting tasks. They proved that the nation's industrial capacity could be multiplied by tapping a workforce that had been largely excluded from heavy manufacturing in peacetime. The time production ended in June 1945. American factories had built 49,234 Sherman tanks. Japan produced approximately 2,300 Hagos over the entire course of the war from 1936 to 1943, when production ceased. The ratio was more than 20-1. But even that understates the disparity, because American tanks were far more capable individually than their Japanese counterparts. Sherman tanks weighed 30 to 35 tons, depending on variant. They had armor ranging from 51 mm on the hull front to 76 mm on the turret mantlet. They carried 5-man crews with dedicated positions for each role. They had gyro-stabilized guns that allowed firing while moving. They had radio equipment in every tank, enabling coordinated operations. They were reliable with tracks that lasted 2,500 meters compared to 500 meters for German tanks, and perhaps 1,000 WWII for Japanese tanks. The Sherman was not the best tank of World War II. It was outgunned by German Tigers and Panthers, but it was good enough, and it was available in overwhelming numbers. In the Pacific Theater, where it faced Japanese tanks designed in the mid-1930s, the Sherman was more than adequate. It was overwhelmingly superior. For Japanese tank crews on subsequent islands, the pattern established at Saipan repeated on Tinian. In July 1944, 7 Type 95s were destroyed in counterattacks against Marine positions. On Pelu, in September 1944, Japanese tanks were dug into cave sand used as stationary pillboxes, recognizing they had no chance in mobile warfare. On Iwima in February 1945, Colonel Techi Nishi's 26th Tank Regiment buried their tanks in volcanic ash up to the turrets, using them as armored bunkers because the tanks provided more protection when stationary than when moving. Even used as static defensive positions, the tanks were vulnerable. 50 caliber machine guns could still penetrate the turret armor. Flamethrower tanks could direct napalm into open hatches and vision ports, cooking crews alive inside their steel coffins. Bazookas could penetrate the thin armor from any angle. The Hargo, once a symbol of Japanese armored might, had become a death trap for its crews. On Okinawa, the last major battle of the Pacific War, the Japanese committed the 27th Tank Regiment to the defense. Their regiment had 13 Type 95 Harrows and 14 Type 97 Kihar medium tanks, 27 tanks total. The Americans landed with over 800 tanks. The numerical disparity was 32 and 32-1. The qualitative disparity was even greater. On May 4th and 5th, 1945, the Japanese launched a major counteroffensive designed to drive the Americans off the island. Tank units were committed to support the infantry assault. The attack failed catastrophically. Most of the Japanese tanks were destroyed within hours, knocked out by a combination of Sherman tanks, bazookas, 37mm Bunny-Peter anti-tank guns, artillery, and 50 caliber machine guns. The survivors withdrew, having accomplished nothing except adding more destroyed hulls to the battlefield. In August 1945, when the Soviet Union declared war on Japan and invaded Manchuria, Japanese tank units in northern China faced yet another technologically superior opponent. Soviet 34 medium tanks with their sloped armor and powerful 76mm guns vastly outclassed the Japanese tanks opposing them. In the Battle of Shumshu Island, part of the Kuril chain, Japanese tanks attempted to defend against Soviet amphibious landings. The Japanese had a mixed force of approximately 77 tanks on Shumshu, including Type 97s and some newer Type 1 medium tanks with only 25 Type 95s. The Soviets used 45 mm mini-anti-tank guns, anti-tank rifles, and anti-tank grenades to devastating effect. The Japanese lost 21 tanks in approximately 2 hours of fighting. Soviet forces, experienced in armored warfare from years of fighting on the Eastern Front in Europe, made short work of the Japanese defenders. The experience of Japanese tank crews during World War II, particularly in the final years, was one of gradual crushing realization. What they had believed about their equipment, about their chances, about their ability to compete with Allied armor, was fundamentally wrong. And the moment of truth for many came not in some epic tank duel between armored champions, but in the terrible simplicity of watching machine gun bullets punch through armor that was supposed to protect them. For Marines who fought at Saipan and subsequent islands, the lessons were different, but equally profound. They learned that Japanese tanks were not a serious threat. They learned that proper equipment and overwhelming firepower made all the difference. They learned that their 50 caliber machine guns, which they had trained with and maintained throughout their service, were actually effective anti-tank weapons in the Pacific theater when engaging thinly armored Japanese vehicles. There was no glory in these lopsided battles. Marines didn't feel heroic shooting at tanks with machine guns and watching them burn. They felt a mixture of relief, pity, and grim satisfaction. Relief that they didn't have to face serious armor opposition, the kind their counterparts in Europe dealt with daily against German tanks. Pity for the men in those Japanese tanks who had been sent to die in equipment that offered them no real protection. Satisfaction that their weapons worked, that American industry had given them the tools they needed to do their job. After the war ended, some surviving Hargo tanks were shipped to the United States for detailed examination at the Aberdeen Proving Ground in Maryland. American engineers and armor specialists studied them carefully over a period of months. They measured armor thickness at multiple points on the hull and turret, documenting the variations. Front hull 12 mm, 3 and 3 purm, side hull 12 mm, rear hull 10 to 12 mm, turret front 12 mm, turret sides 12 mm. Batters. Roof plates 9 mm, belly armor 6 mm. They tested the quality of the steel using metallurgical analysis. The armor was face-hardened, a process that made the outer surface harder than the interior core. This technique was effective against small arms fire, causing bullets to shatter rather than penetrate. But it was ineffective against larger projectiles with sufficient energy to break through the hard outer layer and penetrate the softer interior. They evaluated the internal layout, taking detailed measurements and photographs. The fighting compartment provided barely 50 cubic feet of space for the commander. He had to stand constantly with no seat and no resting position. The turret ring diameter was just 1/200 millimeters, leaving minimal space for a man to work while also operating weapons, loading ammunition, and commanding the tank. The crew positions were cramped to the point of claustrophobia. The driver had a space approximately 2 ft wide and 3 ft deep. His controls were simple, consisting of steering levers, a throttle, and a gear shift. His vision came from a small armored periscope and a direct vision port that could be opened in non-combat situations. The hull machine gunner beside him had even less space, confined to a small cubby with his weapon and limited ammunition storage. American tankers who examined the Hargos could not imagine fighting in such conditions. Sherman crews, by comparison, had a fighting compartment that provided over 150 cubic feet of working space. Each crew member had a defined position with proper seating. The commander had a cupola with allowed vision blocks. The gunner had a telescopic sight and power traverse for the turret. The loader had space to move and access to properly organized ammunition racks. The driver and assistant driver, called the bow gunner in American nomenclature, had adequate space and vision equipment. Their reports confirmed what had been learned in combat and what mathematics had predicted. The Hargo was a light tank suitable for operations against poorly equipped opponents. It could function effectively in colonial warfare, in police actions, in suppressing resistance where the enemy had no serious anti-tank capability. It was not suitable for modern industrial warfare against a peer adversary with proper weapons. Any firearm more powerful than a rifle could defeat its armor. The 50 caliber armor-piercing rounds didn't just penetrate, they overpowered the armor completely, punching through with energy to spare. The internal arrangement was cramped to the point of being actively dangerous, even without enemy fire. The commander's workload, handling all turret functions alone, was unrealistic. The lack of radio equipment in 3 of every 4 tanks made coordinated operations nearly impossible. The hand-cranked turret traverse was exhausting and slow. The vision equipment was crude, leaving the crew largely blind to their surroundings. Every aspect of the design reflected the constraints Japan faced: limited industrial capacity, resource scarcity, and design philosophy rooted in experiences against inferior opponents. The comparison with American tanks revealed the full extent of the design philosophy differences. Where the cargo was cramped, the Sherman was relatively spacious, with enough room for crew members to move, switch positions if necessary, and work effectively even during extended combat operations. Where the Hargo had thin armor vulnerable to machine gun fire at close range, the Sherman resisted dedicated anti-tank guns at combat ranges. Its 51 mm frontal armor, angled at 56 degrees, provided effective protection equivalent to approximately 75 mm against anti-tank projectiles. Where the Hargo had a single-person turret crew performing multiple simultaneous tasks, the Sherman had 3 men in the turret. The commander could focus on commanding using his cupola with 6 vision blocks to maintain situational awareness and direct the crew. The gunner focused exclusively on aiming and firing the main gun using a telescopic sight with magnification and a power traverse system that could rotate the turret quickly and smoothly. The loader focused on maintaining a high rate of fire, pulling rounds from organized racks and loading them efficiently. The Sherman 75 EDM gun had a muzzle velocity of approximately 2,400 ft/s with standard ammunition, giving it effective armor penetration against most targets it would face in the Pacific. The gun was stabilized in the vertical axis, allowing reasonably accurate fire even while the tank was moving, a capability the Hargo completely lacked. The Sherman carried 97 rounds of 75 mm ammunition in protected racks. Compared to the Hargo's 130 rounds of 37 mm ammunition stored loosely throughout the fighting compartment, communication capabilities differed dramatically. Every Sherman had a radio, usually an SCR-528 or STR-538 set, allowing tank-to-tank communication and coordination with infantry and artillery. The Hargo had radios in only 1 tank out of 4, leaving the other 3 to follow visual signals, a system that broke down quickly in combat when smoke, terrain, and enemy action made visual contact impossible. Vision equipment on the Sherman included periscopes with replaceable prisms, direct vision ports with armored covers, and a commander's cup that provided all-around observation. The HGO had crude periscopes and small vision ports that provided minimal situational awareness, forcing commanders to expose themselves by opening hatches to see what was happening around them. Every aspect of design, from ammunition storage to crew comfort to fire control equipment to communication systems, was better on the American tank. But the most telling difference was not in the individual tanks. It was in the numbers and in the industrial systems that produced them. The United States had built an economy that could wage industrial warfare on a global scale. Factories that had produced automobiles now produced tanks at rates that would have seemed impossible in peacetime. The Detroit arsenal alone, in its peak production month, produced more tanks than Japan produced in a typical year. Women who had never worked in heavy industry welded tank hulls and assembled turrets. Engineers constantly improved designs, incorporating lessons learned in combat. The supply chain delivered raw materials to factories and finished tanks to ports with clockwork efficiency. Cargo vessels transported Sherman tanks across both oceans to the fronts in Europe and the Pacific. Field maintenance teams kept these machines running, salvaging damaged vehicles for usable parts and returning repaired tanks to action within days. Japan had never developed anything close to such an industrial system. Its economy had already been exhausted by years of warfare in China before the Pacific conflict even started. Its factories lacked the automation, scale, and mass production efficiency of American industry. Once U.S. submarines began decimating Japan's merchant fleet, access to vital materials grew even tighter. The nation that had dared to challenge the world's greatest manufacturing power was now paying the price for that gamble with every passing battle. For the Japanese tank crews on Saipan that June morning in 1944, and for every tanker who fought afterward across the Pacific, the reality was grim. Their machines were outdated. Their weapons and tactics, once successful in China and Malaya, were relics of a different era. And there was nothing they could do but fight on with what they had, knowing full well that survival was doubtful and victory impossible. The Marines facing them learned other lessons. They discovered that industrial power wins wars, that superior equipment, produced in overwhelming numbers, shapes outcomes more than bravery alone. They realized that courage, discipline, and determination, though essential, cannot offset massive material disadvantages. The real war effort was as much in Detroit, Pittsburgh, and Cleveland as it was on Saipan's beaches. They also learned something immediately practical. When a Japanese Type 95 appeared, you didn't always need artillery, airstrikes, or anti-tank guns, though those were available. You could take it out with your .50 caliber machine gun. At close distances under 200 yards, armor-piercing rounds would slice through the thin steel of its engine housing, sides, or turret, disabling the tank and likely killing its crew. The same weapon built to bring down aircraft could destroy Japanese armor with ease. It was a small lesson in a vast war, but for those involved, for the Japanese tankers who died inside burning Hagos, and for the Marines who destroyed them, it was a moment of brutal clarity. This was not an even fight. This was industrial warfare, where one side possessed an unmatchable advantage in material strength. The result was predetermined. The Type 95s on Saipan and every other Pacific battlefield symbolized more than outdated tanks. They embodied the enormous gap between Japan's ambitions and its actual capacity. They reflected the impossible task faced by Japanese soldiers, ordered to fight a superpower with weapons designed for a bygone conflict. They were the outcome of strategic miscalculations made years earlier, prioritizing ships and planes over ground forces, assuming morale could make up for inferior technology. Mistaking early victories for lasting strength. When those first .50 caliber rounds tore through Hago armor on Saipan, they revealed a truth that would echo throughout the rest of the Pacific War and beyond. In modern total war, production, engineering, and logistics decide the fate of nations. No amount of valor or tactical brilliance can compensate for being outnumbered 10 to 1 and outclassed by decades of technological progress. The Japanese tankers who rolled out that morning believed they were driving dependable machines. By nightfall on June 17th, the few who survived understood the cruel truth. They had been sent to fight in vehicles so lightly built that bullets pierced straight through. They had been given tools suitable for the wars of the 1930s, not for the mechanized inferno of the 1940s, and yet they kept fighting, kept serving, and kept dying inside steel coffins that could no longer protect them.